So in this video we're going to make a wiring harness for a Haltech Elite 750. This is for a Rover 3.9 V8 engine. The engine's going to be completely standalone, no integration with the car. It's going to have just an Elite 750 running semi-sequential and weighted spark. It's going to have a Haltech dashboard, a Haltech fuse box. It's literally a case of put the loom around the engine, put the battery terminals on, and the engine will run. The car is going to go into an off-road vehicle, which makes it a bit difficult to do on the rolling road and so on because of the massive wheels and chunky tyres and things, and it's an auto. So this one will actually be tuned on an engine dyno. So what we're going to do is take the universal harness we've got here stretched out across the floor. We've obviously gone into our Haltech and we've assigned all our functions and pin numbers and so on. So we now need to separate out the wires to create bundles of cables for each part. You know, we need a ground and a signal wire for the air temp and the coolant temp. We need to run the injector live and the injector cables out, and just bundle them together and then cut them to length. And what we'll probably do is just wait till we're at the engine dyno, put the harness round the engine and cut everything to length and terminate the plugs on the engine. So this is the premium version, which comes with the extra fuse box. You can get a basic version of the loom, which is just literally the plug into the ECU itself and the wires out only. So we've got a bunch of injectors and ignition wires here. We need to provide the power supplies to them, and then what we're going to do is we're going to run 4 wires because we've got a weighted spark set up and a semi-sequential set up, which means we need to pair 2 cylinders together. So if you take your firing order, the first cylinder and the 5th cylinder, the 2nd and 6th, 3rd and 7th, 4th and 8th cylinders basically wired together. And on this particular engine, because it's a cross-plane crank and the firing order, it means actually we will be going across the banks. So for example, cylinder 1 and cylinder 6 we put together, and they're on opposite banks, for example. So it's not like a 4-cylinder where you use the outer inner cylinders. Some of the flat plane cranks you might do that, but so this is a cross-plane crank engine, so we need to take care as to which ones we wire together. We then need to provide the wiring for the sensors. It's a very simple engine setup, so I've gone for a couple pins for the idle control valve, got our 4 ignitions and 4 injections, wire for the oil pressure switch, and then we've got basic sensors like TPS, intake temp and coolant temp, and then we use the onboard map sensor. We've also got to take the CAN wires and some power and ground out to the dashboard, but this is already done as part of the loom here. We've got a CAN cable here. This is the plug for the ECU and the rest is here. So all we need to do is now separate out the wires, put them together in the bundles they need, for example, grounds and like analogs and lives and whatever we need to put together, and then just bundle them up, then possibly either unpin or coil away the wires we don't need. It's quite easy to unpin them, so I probably will unpin the wires we don't need and make up a sort of base harness we can then take to the engine, and then we can wrap around the engine, cut to length, and then like the old loom I've got here for reference, this is off a Mega Squirt, which we've, should we say, put in the bin because it's not very good. Make something similar to that. Once it's all cut to length and done nicely, we can tie it all up and label it all up properly. So the first thing I'm going to get is the battery positive. We've got 2, one for the ECU, one for the fuel injectors, and we need the battery ground cables and the ignition. The ignition one I need to pull back through because that will be inside the cabin and the ECU will be inside the cabin. The rest of them will be in the engine bay with the ECUs. We need to put them through the grommet still. And then I'll probably pull out the positive to the fuel pump as well. I believe that will be going through the inside of the car. We'll start with that. So in here we should have some nice big thick red wires in here. Here we go. So we've got battery positive. Next one we wanted was battery ground. So the next ones we want is the fuel pump and the ignition. They're going to be inside the vehicle, so we need to pull these back through the grommet and onto this side. So we've pulled the internal wires to the vehicle back through. So we've got the fuel pump and the ignition there, and we've got the main power supplies now and the main ground separated out over here. Next wire we will need is the trigger wiring. So we need the trigger and home. In this case we have no cam sensors, so we're actually going to not use the home, we're just going to use the trigger. That's inside a shielded wire, like this. You can see this big shielded wire here for trigger. And we're going to separate that out into our existing engine bay pile. We're not going to use the home, we'll remove that from the loom. Okay, so the next ones we need is the analog wires for the coolant temp, the air temp and throttle position. Throttle position will need a 5 volt, the rest of them will just need signal grounds. If we pull out the signal grounds, the required analog pins and the 5 volt pin wires, we can put them in our engine bay bundle as well. In this case, Haltech have been quite useful and actually separated out the commonly used analog pins for air temp, coolant temp and TPS, and they've actually already bundled them with a sensor ground, and in TPS cases a 5 volt as well, so you've already got these as a bundle. So you just need to pull this bundle back and separate them out. The next big bundle I've pulled out is the injectors. This includes 6 injector wires, but we only need 4 of them. It also includes a power full injectors from the ECU, or from the fuse box we say. These are the same with the ignition coils. The ignition coils, however, need an additional ground for these coils to work properly. There isn't a ground in this bundle, so we need to add that. But same again, there's 6 ignition coil wires, we need 4 of them. So what I've done is now separated out the definitely going to the engine versus the definitely deleting. Some of the wires need to separate further to take a couple digital pins for the idle control and a couple of powers and grounds out this bundle, and then the internal stuff's down over here. So if you've got a nice big open space, you can lay your wiring out like this. You can really separate your wires and get them all organised and start chopping out or unpinning what you don't need. Then you can start taping up each individual bundle so it runs together to keep all the wires together as a nice, neat sort of single piece to run through around the engine. So I've just noticed a little error in this loom. I'm supposed to have 6 each of the injector and ignition wires, and I've just taped up all the ignition wires to hold them together so they don't fray. And I noticed I've only got 4. Now these are pins 1 to 4, which is what I need. But I've also noticed I've now got 8 in the injector loom. I should only have 6. Or at least that's what the instructions are telling me anyway. So I need to pull out the colours I don't need from here. So I need to keep the blue, blue and black, blue and brown, blue and red, and all the rest of them need to be pulled out. So what we'll do is we'll actually open this plug up and unpin the wires we don't need and pull them back through the loom. So what we need to do to open the loom up is pop a screwdriver into this tab here, push it until it clicks. You'll see these little white ones have popped up. That means we can now pull pins out the back of the plug. So don't be too aggressive with it, because you might pull your pins out in one go by mistake. But now we can just slide the pins out. Once we're happy to remove all the wires we want, we can just push these tabs back down with our screwdriver to lock it all off again. So here indeed, in pins 7, 8, where we're supposed to have the additional yellow wires, we do have some blue wires. So these will be removed along with the other unneeded 2 injector wires. So I've pulled out some of the cables we need. I've got rid of the home wires, the additional injector and ignition wires. And then just to lock the thing off, we need to push these back in here. Use your finger, if not, use a screwdriver. And that will secure the rest of the plugs back in. Just need to cut these cable ties off the loom, and then we can pull the wires back through and get rid of them. So it's worth noting that not all wires go into the ECU plug. For example, there's only a couple pins that provide power and ground out of the actual ECU plug, and then they're joined in the loom somewhere as a splice of several wires. You can see here the CAN wires get their power and ground from somewhere else. Here's the home signals, but you can see that the shielding, the ground and the power supply for the home actually comes off a splice further up in the loom. So you need to not only unpin these 2, but then make small snips here to disconnect these wires, and be sure that you insulate them afterwards to make sure that you've got no exposed lives and grounds here that could end up shorting out inside your loom. So snip them, make sure they're insulated. So I've separated out all the main bundles, and each of the main bundles I've taped every sort of 6 inches or so to keep them all together, stop the wires fraying, tangling and so on. I've laid everything out here. Now all the basics are there. What I need to do now is the idle control, which means I need to take 2 DPOs out of the DPO bundle over here, and some power and ground for the idle control valve, and then also want to run a DPI switch for an oil pressure switch, which will also be bundled into one of these input bundles over here somewhere. Here you go. So once that's done, then we just need to unpin and remove the rest of the unneeded wires, and we're good to go. So to make the idle control valve, I've got a spare ground and live there, and I need to put out DPO 1 and 2 here. So I made a couple of changes to the wiring diagram. I'm now using an analog input to the oil pressure switch. Now AVI1 on this particular ECU doesn't have a pull-up resistor, which means I'm going to have to splice a pull-up resistor into the loom somewhere. Additionally, I've also allocated AVI3, which is normally for the external map sensor, which we don't need because we're using an onboard map sensor, as a nitrous enable switch. So I've taken that and a power and ground into the cabin. So coiled up here, we're going to have a switch in the cabin which allows you to turn the nitrous on and off. And then what I've done is I've got a nitrous controller on DPO3, which I'm going to pull back into the fuse box here, and I'm going to allocate one of these spare relays and fuses to actually put power to the nitrous solenoid. So what's going to happen is the ignition power will come to the power of the relay. The purple DPO will trigger the relay, and then we'll put some high current wires from the battery into the fuse box, out the fuse box, back into the engine bay and the ground, which then can go off to power the solenoids. So you can trigger your nitrous control. Additionally, there's a few wires I can remove as well now. So obviously we removed these already, but I can also now remove the DPO4 wire and then 2 DPI wires because I'm no longer using them for anything. So I'm going to unpin them from the loom as well. So the final bunch of wires I've got left here are 12 volt and sensor grounds that are additional we don't need. So what we need to do is just trace them back through the loom, find the point in here where they're all spliced together and just remove them. The 12 volt may be completely removable because we're not using 12 volt anywhere. I believe 12 volt may also be spliced in with the triggers, but again we're using a 2-pin variable reluctance sensor which doesn't need the 12 volts and ground in there anyway, so we could in theory remove the 12 volts from the loom completely. The sensor grounds, we are using some of them, but it'll come back to a point here like this where they're all spliced together. We just need to snip out the ones we're not using. So I've snipped out the extra sensor grounds here. We can't remove the 12 volts completely because what I forgot was happening was the 12 volts goes down the CAN line into the CAN plug. But we can remove all these pins here from this part here and just seal this off. So now that's snipped off, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap up the first part of this engine side of the loom into one bundle. If you look at the old loom, you can see there's a certain amount of length between, where are we? Certain amount of length between the ECU plug and where the loom fans out in the engine. This is to go through the firewall and through the body. So I'm going to make a similar length on our one, just make it all to one point with one big massive wire and then let it fan out to a certain point. And when we get onto the engine dyno as well, we can actually wrap the cables around to length. And we also know we've got enough length in the body to put the ECU where we want to put the ECU. So our loom's now all sorted, ready to be taken to the engine. We can then wrap the loom around the engine, cut everything to length, put the plugs on. Once we're happy all the plugs are on the right lengths are good, then we can obviously wrap the loom in either a heat shrink or a loom tape of some sort, or maybe some of this stuff, or however the owner thinks best to protect the loom. The only thing left to wire in here is the control wire to fire this additional relay, but what we'll need to do is get a power feed from the battery through a spare fuse hole into a spare relay and then trigger this relay here with this pin using this wire, and then the high amperage current from the battery can go through here off to another wire to the engine bay for the nitrous solenoids to work. So final thing before we take the loom to the engine, I've just plugged in the ECU, powered it up with some jump leads, uploaded my test map and just connected the dashboard to make sure the dashboard's got CAN connectivity. You can see that we've got -10 on the air temp and coolant temp because they're not plugged in obviously. And obviously the dashboard is showing the same things. So everything looks good, just need to plug it up, put it on the engine. Alright, I hope you found that useful. On the next video we're actually going to take the loom to the engine obviously and put the plugs on, test it and show you how to make sure the loom's all working properly.